All right, let's jump right into this. Welcome to our latest explainer. Today, we're taking some incredibly complex and, frankly, highly charged source material, and we're breaking it down so you can see exactly what's being argued and why it actually matters. We are impartially unpacking a fascinating interview from Promethean Action, which was featured on the Rich Does Politics channel. Now, the guest in this interview outlines what they see as a massive, multi-front ideological war for the very soul of America. So we're going to strip away the noise, look directly at the specific claims being made, and map out these dueling visions that are actively shaping modern political rhetoric. To really grasp this clash, we have to start at the core premise of the interview, which is anchored by this quote attributed to Donald Trump. The guest asserts that the Democratic Socialists of America, the DSA, represent a modern communist threat. In fact, they call them the deepest internal threat the country faces today. The entire interview basically stems from this single intense idea that the political left isn't just proposing different policies, they're actively engaging in a fundamental ideological revolution. So to unpack all of this, we've organized their arguments into four distinct paradigms. First, the ideological threat. Second, rewriting American history. Third, the American system. And finally, global institutional pushback. Starting with Section 1, the ideological threat, specifically cultural Marxism and the DSA's minimalist demands. The guest's theoretical framing is fascinating because it traces our current political climate all the way back to early 20th century Marxist theorists, specifically Antonio Gramsci and Georgy Lukács. According to the guest, these theorists were trying to figure out why Marxist revolutions kept failing to take hold in the West. Their conclusion? The main barrier was Western Christian culture. So the guest claims their resulting strategy, what's often called cultural Marxism, was basically to make a population despise its own culture and heritage. The logic here is pretty straightforward. If you can destroy a people's sense of identity and their belief in their own nation, you completely remove their will to fight, which makes a revolution entirely possible. Now, the crucial part is how the guest connects that century-old theory to what's happening right now. They point straight to the DSA and what they call their minimalist demands. We're talking promises like free rent, free schooling, free healthcare, and even free grocery stores. But the guest argues these aren't just well-meaning social safety nets. Instead, they frame them as a highly calculated tactic. The goal? To heighten the contradictions of capitalism, literally bankrupt the system, and condition younger generations to accept handouts rather than build their own capacity. They even cite an alleged 2025-2026 DSA manifesto that supposedly outlines a maximalist goal of eventually tossing out the U.S. Constitution entirely. All right, moving to Section 2, rewriting American history and the battle for the founding narrative. If the strategy is to make people hate their culture, the guest argues that the very first target is history. So, we're seeing two competing narratives fighting for dominance. On one hand, we have the narrative popularized by initiatives like the 1619 Project. The guest claims this teaches youth that the founding fathers were nothing more than slave-holding land grabbers who plundered indigenous peoples. The guest fiercely rejects this. On the other hand, we have their counter-narrative. They argue the true founding story is actually this incredible, against-all-odds break from the British Empire, spearheaded by brilliant minds. They specifically point to folks like Benjamin Franklin, elevating him not just as a statesman, but as a top-tier, world-class scientist. And the source actually takes this historical argument a step deeper into philosophy, drawing a really sharp contrast between two thinkers, John Locke and Gottfried Leibniz. Now, most of us were taught in school that the founders were heavily inspired by John Locke's idea of the pursuit of property. But the guest argues that the core Philadelphia founders were actually aligned with the German philosopher Leibniz. For Leibniz, the pursuit of happiness absolutely wasn't about acquiring stuff or, getting free handouts. It was about fulfilling a mission and pushing human creativity to its absolute highest capacity. This is a profound distinction because it sets the exact foundation for the guest's entire economic worldview. Which brings us perfectly into Section 3, the American system, an alternative economic paradigm. The source maps out a really stark contrast here. They actually lumped together two systems they see as equally destructive, Marxism and what they call rapacious finance capital. They argue that predatory finance capitalism takes the wage calculation out of the equation entirely. It just prioritizes extreme efficiency by offshoring jobs to places like China. But then they present their alternative, the American system. This paradigm, they argue, doesn't value raw goods or cheap labor. It values the human mind's capacity for invention. It prioritizes domestic manufacturing, massive infrastructure, and paying living wages so that workers can actually participate in the economy they're building. To really dismantle traditional Marxist theory, the guest uses a very specific, practical historical example. Karl Marx theorized that massive technological advances would inevitably cause profit rates to fall, which would eventually lead to the collapse of capitalism. But the guest points to Henry Ford. Ford invented incredible new technology, sure, but he pragmatically decided to pay his workers a living wage. Why? So they could actually afford to buy the cars they were building. The guest argues this single action fundamentally disproved Marxist thesis because it proved that capital and labor can exist in harmony to create a hyper-productive economy. The interview then traces the historical lineage of this American system through four key figures. It starts with Alexander Hamilton, who championed the first national bank and pushed for an economy based on invention rather than just agriculture. From there, it moves to Abraham Lincoln, who fundamentally believed the human mind itself is labor. Then to William McKinley. And finally, to Donald Trump, who the guest claims is attempting a modern revival of this exact system. But here's where they make a genuinely startling assertion. They claim that Hamilton, Lincoln, and McKinley were all assassinated by British interests, specifically to stop this American economic system from threatening global financial powers. That takes us to our fourth and final section, global institutional pushback, the forces supposedly opposing the American system. Now, we need to break down the guests' most intense claims regarding the intelligence community because they allege massive entities are actively fighting this economic revival. First, they claim the CIA and Mossad spied on Trump and Kushner's negotiations. Next, they point to Reagan-era Executive Order 12333, claiming it allowed the intelligence community to essentially privatize their operations to avoid public scrutiny. And finally, under that umbrella, they allege that organizations like the ADL and Freedom House are actually acting as CIA assets, using humanitarian work as a convenient cover to thwart populist movements. And the guest extends this alleged conspiracy beyond the U.S. intelligence community, reaching over to the UK. They outline a geopolitical counter-strategy specifically attributed to Mark Carney and the City of London. The alleged agenda here is huge, forming a unified Euro-Pacific bloc to oppose Trump's economic policies, locking in a trans-Pacific partnership with the EU, fiercely maintaining the Davos's green agenda, and, perhaps most controversially of all, ensuring the Ukraine war continues indefinitely as a way to centralize European defense and launder resources. We have covered a tremendous amount of ground here, from century-old theories of cultural Marxism to the philosophies of Leibniz, all the way up to massive allegations of global intelligence conspiracies. It brilliantly illustrates just how deeply intertwined economics, history, and culture actually are in today's political rhetoric. So I want to leave you with a final provocative question to consider, based on the source material we've explored today. Are we witnessing a true historical revival of the American system of economics? Or are we simply seeing a repackaging of historical populism custom designed for a brand new era of global conflict? Thank you for joining me on this explainer, and keep questioning the narratives shaping our world.